We're going to move on to a great plenary session here, and I would like to invite the members of that to start to make their way forward. But, you know, part of what's driving international action on climate change are the discussions that go on, frankly, throughout the year, but culminate every year at the International Conference of the Parties. The next session is appropriately titled From Glasgow to Sharm El-Sheikh, International Climate Action and Outlooks. You know, there's been in recent years a number of milestone accomplishments, beginning with the Paris agreements in 2015, culminating last year in Glasgow with the Glasgow Accords. But no one believes that the job is anywhere close to finish. Yes, there's progress being made, but there's much to do. And I'm going to now turn this over to the moderator for the next panel, Kelley, Kizzier of EDF. I think many of you have had the privilege of working with Kelley, but if you haven't, she has been really spearheading a lot of EDF's leadership worldwide on critical challenges facing global action on climate change. So without further ado, Kelley, I'm going to turn it over to you. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I think we're just waiting for Dirk, Forrister, and Nat Keohane to join virtually. There they are. Do we have both? We do.
Hi, Kelley.
Good morning, Dirk. Good morning, Nat.
Good morning.
Thanks, everybody, for
Good
this
to see
session.
you.
I hope that we can make it. Can everyone hear? Nat, can you say good morning again?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Perfect.
So we hope this session is really interactive. We want you guys to ask the questions you want to ask about what needs to happen this year to make it a successful COP27. And as Craig said, we really work throughout the year. The COP is the culmination of year-long or years-long efforts. So Nat, I'm going to turn to you first. I think in COP26, we saw a little bit of a different direction. Of course, we got an amazing agreement on Article 6 rules, but we also saw more focus on the cover decision than we ever have before. What do you see as the impact of that change and really the focus of this year on the road to COP27?
Well, thanks, Kelley, and it's great to see you and Lisa and Dirk online, and thanks to the organizers for including me. So yes, I do think it, and I know we'll dive into the details, I'm sure, of Article 6 and other pieces like that, but I think the context is useful to start with. And as you said, it was a good outcome, a really good outcome, I think, probably at the upper end of the possibilities that we saw in Glasgow, but it does create a work program going forward that I think provides the context for how we think about carbon markets and Article 6 and so on. I think one thing you saw in Glasgow and that we will need to continue to focus on going forward is really the bringing in of an emphasis not just on mitigation and increasing ambition and implementing targets, but also really wrapping in the other pillars of the Paris Agreement, climate finance and adaptation. So as folks probably know, coming out of Glasgow, there are several key issues to be discussed, both this year and then really in the lead up to COP28. There's mitigation work program, really focused on ambition, and with a particular focus as well on implementation. And we can talk about that. There's a focus on adaptation, building up to this, determining a global goal on adaptation. And then there's, as I mentioned, a focus on climate finance to really not only meet the $100 billion pledge, but also think about what the next pledge could be and how to really scale up climate finance. And I think as never before, we're seeing how important thinking about all three of those pillars together is for the success of the negotiations and for making progress on each of those. We've got to make progress on all of them. I'll mention the fourth piece, the fourth sort of leg of this, of the table, as it were, which I think is really important to focus on, and that's the global stock take. And of course, Kelley, I know we've been working a little bit on this together as well. The global stock take, as folks know, was mentioned. It sort of gets a one-line mention in the Paris Agreement and a brief mention, I think, in the accompanying decision. But it's a sort of empty vessel that needs to be filled in some sense. And I think the Glasgow decision went a long way towards filling it. But the global stock take is, set for 2023 for COP28. It's meant to be a way of focusing on the need to step up implementation and ambition across all of those areas I mentioned, and meant to be a way of increasing the environmental effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. I think for it to succeed, it needs to be more than just a look back and sort of a comparison between the emissions trajectory we're on and where we need to be for 1.5 degrees. If that's all it is, we could all write the decision today. Instead, it really needs to be a process that drives greater and empowers countries to do more effective implementation of their targets across mitigation, finance, and adaptation. So you've got that work program I mentioned, but you've also got this global stock take that's going to be underway. I think it's really important that that is a robust process, that it brings in non-parties, including the high-level champions, and that it really focuses attention on what countries can do to meet their targets and be more ambitious in the next round.
Thanks, Nat. Dirk, I'm going to turn to you. Nat mentioned implementation, and we know we got this amazing, after years of waiting, decision on Article 6. I think that the real question for people is how countries are going to choose to use that. And I know IETA has been doing some work and that you have been talking to countries. What are the plans to use Article 6 and how is it being implemented?
Thanks, Kelley, and big apology that I can't be there in person, but I really appreciate Craig and Jen and the team making it possible for us to appear virtually. So I guess in a sense, we're back to regular order, perhaps, where it's not all this primary focus on what's going to happen once a year at the COP, but it's really is rubber hitting the road in terms of how countries choose to use it. And in some senses, I think the big jurisdictions that you think of in the world of emissions trading, like the EU or the California-Quebec model, those just continue to chug along. Europe is certainly looking at tightening its targets to be more in line with its net zero goals. And, as part of their contribution to that global stock take, getting prepared for that. But I think the interesting stuff on Article 6 is happening elsewhere, probably, right? And that is, I'm really fascinated at what Japan is looking to do on setting up kind of a new, I think they're going to call it a league of companies that volunteer to take on serious climate commitments, serious commitments for getting to net zero. And as in the past with Japan, this can include use of international credits, at least for some component. We're looking to see what exactly the details of that will be, but during the Kyoto era, that was it was really material in carbon markets that Japan took voluntary in a way much more seriously than anywhere else. So watch that one. I also think that countries like Singapore, some smaller countries that have a vision of becoming leaders in their region. Singapore certainly has an interest in being a leader in building out trading models that leverage its existing trading infrastructure. I think Singapore is one to watch. They're doing some really interesting stuff with us and with the World Bank on setting up sort of new data infrastructure for linking various types of registries together in a common data format, kind of a metadata project. And I really appreciate Singapore's kind of embracing of Article 6, both for their own use, but also in trying to be an enabler for others to use it. More in the Americas, I think we're watching Canada. I'm going to let Lisa talk about any wisdom on Canada since she's closer to it than any of us. But I think in the Americas, I'm really excited to see what the countries in the Pacific Alliance are doing together on, again, lining systems for the potential of linkage in the future. But probably the one that's most forward-leaning out of that group, and I say this with some trepidation because I know Chile's always a leader in the world of Article 6, but I'm quite interested in what Colombia is doing, because Colombia has a carbon pricing program that has a market component. It's working quite well, but it needs to be extended to more sectors. And as part of their strategizing on that, they're looking for building out a national strategy for broader use of Article 6, because I think particularly in the area of forestry, they have more crediting potential than they may need for their own programs, so they could both meet their own needs and extend to others. And that calculus, Kelley, I think is one we're going to see in a lot of countries where they want to develop their own game plan, first to assure that they can meet their own national commitments in the seller context, but then looking for what kind of investment they may be able to attract for accelerating their own pathway to net zero by leaning on Article 6. The last one I'll mention in that, just to go to another continent, is South Africa. And South Africa has a carbon pricing program. It's a carbon tax plus offset program, similar to Colombia. It's stimulated a pretty vibrant domestic market, but they haven't gotten to the hard part yet. You know, the targets are going to extend to cover more sectors, but they're also going to go deeper. And there's a real interest there in complementing the public finance that's coming in to help on their decarbonization effort. The United States has provided a large slug of money for that, but also to kind of augment that with a carbon market that might become a way for them to either be a buyer in their region or to be a seller in a more global context. So they are in the early days. Again, we're active there with other kind of carbon market pioneers in South Africa in setting up a forum for regular engagements on how to take that market forward. So if I really step back from it, you're just starting to see these little episodes around. They're not necessarily all joined up, but I do think this focus on how are we going to meet our own contribution, and then how can we use the market for doing more? I think that's going to play out more and more in a lot of countries.
Thanks, Dirk. Lisa, you always, when I was co-chairing Article 6, provided us with legal advice, meaning, will this work in the real world? Obviously, the decision on Article 6 gave us the top level things we needed, but there's a lot of detail still to be uncovered. With that, what do you think are the key things that need to come out of this next level of decisions to really make it functional in the real world?
Thanks, Kelley, very much. If I can regress for a minute.
Of course.
You are all, many of you are Americans, and I sit on the panel with 3 Americans who are foundational in achieving Article 6, and you might not appreciate what a role a number of people have played, not just in establishing trust, but also on the front line as co-facilitator of the Article 6 working group, behind the scenes as an excellent, outstanding policymaker, and business and markets coming together through leadership of the 3 people you have in front of you. So I would like you to help me acknowledge the work that they have done as outstanding. And I can say that from the belly of the beast. So
Well,
to your
thank you, and that was surprising. Thanks, Lisa. She always does this to me and surprises me.
Yeah.
But one person we have to mention, if we're going to do
Yes.
that, if I can get through it, is Hugh Seeley, who sadly passed away 2 weeks ago and co-chaired Article 6 for its entirety, was a great friend of mine. And we spent 3 years, absolutely. And I'm not going to make it through it. Don't you start.
I'm not looking at you.
But really, I hope we can carry on the work that Hugh started, making sure carbon markets have integrity. Now, I made it through that. Did you?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
So really, this is just a crying session for Lisa and I on a podium. That's why we're here. What needs to be implemented in Article 6 to carry on Hugh's legacy, to make sure it has integrity, and to make sure it's operational? And thank you so much for, you have no idea how much Lisa worked in the background as well. So it's not 3 people up here that were giants for Article 6. It is definitely 4. So did I give you enough time to recover?
Thank you. I
Good.
recovered. Yes.
Okay, good.
We did a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
We have 3 decisions, the Article 6.2 decision around bilateral trading and mechanisms to achieve internationally transferable mitigation outcomes. We've got Article 6.4, which provides for a new mechanism that is guided by a subsidiary body. We have to stand up that subsidiary body in its full form. We have to, in a way that you'll all be very familiar with, but that takes a little bit more work on the international front, come up with the rules of procedural fairness. In your tribunals, you'd call it due process. All of the rules and requirements of that new body, the subsidiary supervisory body, to facilitate the Article 6.4. And then on Article 6.2, we've got countries and companies. And this is where you all come into play. Countries and companies that need to come together to fill in the blanks where we have uncertainty. And there's a fair amount of capacity building to be done, particularly in the context of the G77 that have a daunting new target in front of them. This is new under Paris and great new mechanism, but they need some processes and procedures on how to implement that. So we have a few milestones coming up. In May, we have some drafts coming out on what those rules might be. And then we've got an intersessional negotiating session in the middle of June that we hope to see a lot of these issues come to bear, and come to bear with a level of market pragmatism. So exactly what Kelley said. What works from a commercial perspective? What is never going to fly from a commercial perspective? And dare I say, we have a little bit of tidying to do in the decision text itself. And for the OCD lawyers in the room, this will be near and dear to your heart. We do have to dot a few I's and cross a few T's, and maybe take a little bit of a mild eraser to crunch a few things together, a few ands and ors that we need to work out. So at a very high level, that's what we need to do.
Thanks, Lisa. You acknowledge that three of us are, from the United States here, and we're in a conference in the United States. Nat, I'll turn to you. How do you think that the US policy context is going to intersect and influence the outcomes at COP27?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but an important one, I think. I'll start by reflecting on last year, where with President Biden coming in January of last year into the White House, bringing in Secretary, now Special Presidential Envoy Kerry, into the lead foreign policy and climate role, a whole of government approach throughout Washington and throughout the government. We saw the effectiveness of that, and we saw how that kind of, I think, gave a jumpstart to an additional boost. I don't want to say jumpstart, because other jurisdictions and countries and regions, particularly Europe, were really leading the way while the US had stepped back. But it did give a boost to the process last year. You saw that in the summit that President Biden held 100 days in at Earth Day almost a year ago. You saw that in the diplomacy in the lead up to COP26. I think you saw that in some of the success of the outcomes. And so that's what we see. When it can happen when you have a really engaged presidential administration in the White House, and you see the kind of push from the US. The challenge now is, of course, having the US live up to the promise of the targets it put on the table last year. I think having the US put forward that 50 to 52% below 2005 target, the NDC for 2030 was a big boost and led to ambition from others. But to do that, to meet that target, the administration is going to need to enact a range of policies, I would say, starting with additional legislation in the US Congress. You had a bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed last year that had a big slug of money, about $100 billion for climate spending of various sorts in that. So already a great down payment. I was just interviewing Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm the other day, and they are totally focused on how to build that, how to put that money out there into the economy to deploy clean energy solutions and cut emissions throughout the economy. But we need much more than that. As folks will probably know, there's a $550 billion, so nearly $500 billion amount of investment that was in the Build Back Better framework that President Biden put forward last fall that is now stalled in the Senate. It's really important both for the US ambition to meet its target and therefore for the global politics of climate, it's really important for Congress to enact at least the climate and energy provisions in that Build Back Better framework, no longer known as Build Back Better, but that's the term. So it's going to be important to get that done. I'm optimistic about that, but the window we will have now that Justice Jackson has been confirmed, the window we have is going to be between the Easter recess and the 4th of July recess. And most of the negotiation has to happen before that. So we're expecting to see not a huge public negotiation, but backroom conversations between Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, Senator Schumer, others like Senator Coons and Senator Whitehouse. That the Senate is going to be really key, and it's very important that the Congress pass those provisions and put them on the president's desk. Even beyond that, I think that would be the necessary, the minimum condition, but we're also going to have to see pretty aggressive actions from the administration and its regulatory and executive actions. And so a whole range of things need to happen. If that happens, and if Congress passes that legislation in particular, then I think we will see continued trust in the United States. I think the US can come into COP27 continuing to be a champion alongside Europe and others, and continuing to press for greater ambition. If the Congress fails to act, I think that really will hobble the US and President Biden and Secretary Kerry. And I think it'll make it more difficult to really push, at least for the US, to push for progress. So a lot is riding, I think, on the votes, particularly of Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, but really on the efforts of the administration to push that through.
Thanks, Nat. I mean, I think you've underscored it, but just to really double down on that, I can't stress enough how important it was for the agreement on Article 6 to have the US show up at COP26 at the political level. So the US continued throughout to be very, very involved at the technical level. And a lot of what you see in Article 6 comes from that, that really smart work of the US delegation on Article 6, also many other delegations, but having them there at a political level, I think was one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that we found breakthrough. So turning to carbon markets, the sort of topic at hand, how disruptive do you think, how much would it upset the apple cart if the US comes in as not considered to be a credible actor? That's a question to Dirk and Lisa. And back on Dirk's prompt, Canada is facing its own challenges.
Absolutely.
When it comes to carbon markets and carbon pricing. And what if, 2/3 of North America comes up without much credibility backing these nationally determined contributions? Dirk, I'll go to you first and then turn to you, Lisa, to cover both.
Sure.
Well,
Sorry, not an easy question, but an important one, I think.
I think first I gotta salute California again, because if it wasn't for California and Reggie, we'd be a whole lot worse off, right? In terms of a demonstrated commitment abroad, and frankly, in illustrating creative ways that you can design markets to work in particular locations, because those markets are slightly different, but they really are important. The other thing that I would say related to that is, people that have been doing this as long as the four of us, and probably so many of the people in your audience, know that the pathway to get the program in California and the program in New England all started on the backs of voluntary commitments and voluntary market efforts. This was, going way, way back. Some of the first pilot trades that the United States was engaged in were LADWP and SoCal Edison in California, and New England Electric in the Northeast, AES from Virginia. They were out as true pioneers, sort of demonstrating how carbon offsets could work in a credible way. That seems like ages ago, but I, in some ways, feel like we've rebooted and we're back there. But this time, it's driven by financial regulators and driven by the banks regulated by those financial regulators, and those guys needing to show that they've got credible pathways to greening their own investment portfolios and having a true path to net zero. true path to a 1.5 degree net zero. They might should have taken the deal a few years ago when it was just 2 degrees, but it's 1.5 is what everybody's aspiring to now. And I think the building out of a private market across, frankly, across the globe is going to be an important complement. And it's going to be part of the US story, because as dysfunctional as our Congress is right now on the topic of climate change, and as polarized as it is, the business community is not polarized in the same way. There are still naysayers. We all know that. But the number of companies that have crossed the Rubicon of embracing the Paris Agreement, embracing net zero, embracing aggressive climate action and decarbonization, it's phenomenal, right? And I think we've got to find a way to tap into that. Part of that is the work that Kelley, you're involved in. I think all of the efforts for improving the veracity of and integrity of voluntary markets. But I think the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market is incredibly important in kind of developing thresholds that everyone can trust in terms of carbon crediting standards, but also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative itself about, you know, sort of reframing the way that claims work. So if people in the audience aren't familiar with those, I think if these work right, if they're properly designed and pragmatic, then I think you could see a real boost in market or in climate action and markets enabling that. So that to me is part of the picture. And you got to mention the SEC rulemaking that has begun now. I think proposed just last week. The CFTC is also rattling the saber a little bit about whether it needs to get involved. So I think we might have a carbon market that's sort of driven by financial regulation more than traditional environmental regulation here in the near term.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. I'm gonna come back in the next round on that importance of business engagement. But I want to turn to Lisa with the same question.
I'm going to tag team on that. First of all, let me make very clear, there is a lot of money to be made out there through and via the Article 6 rules. But one of the requirements is when you create an Article 6 unit that can be transferred, it doesn't exist unless you're in compliance with your NDC, right? That's one of the elements that's required. So if you think you're not going to hit your NDC targets and have full access and benefit and profit from this vibrant 130 trillion of financing new into the market, you're mistaken. So both Canada and the US have to comply with those targets to realize the value in those markets. So get busy. And for us too, we have to get busy. Most particularly after we've just approved a very large new oil project that might make it a little more difficult for Canada to meet its target. But let me follow up on Dirk's point about a new class of actors in this market. You can go at it. You can actually develop the market through new legislation that is market friendly with flexibility and options to achieve your goals, or you can do it on the back of prosecutions and investigations and regulation implemented by your securities and other financial regulators. Your SEC and our conglomeration of our 10 mini SECs across all the provinces, the Canadian Securities Administrators broadly, have all issued disclosure rules in the last several months and don't think they're not going to enforce them. So you can go there through robust legislation that has been crafted with the likes of these folks who understand and appreciate compliance, flexibility in markets, or you can go there through regulation and prosecution and investigation. The choice is yours.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, just a step back up to a higher level. we also need to talk about the other global geopolitical crisis. You mentioned Canada and oil. I think it's all on our mind. Nat, I'll turn to you. What do you expect the impacts of the crisis in Ukraine to be on the road to COP and even on COP27? And Dirk, I'll turn to you after, because I know IETA have actually done some modeling on what those impacts could look like. So let's start at the higher level, atmospheric level. Like, what does this mean geopolitically? And then really, what does the modeling show it's going to mean specifically for carbon markets? Nat.
Yeah, thanks, Kelley. I'll start. I'll take that 35,000 foot level, and Dirk can drill in and also maybe provide more insight on COP27. Although I can speak a little bit to that. So I think, I mean, folks are going to, obviously, folks in the audience are aware of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has roiled energy markets, right? Both just oil markets. Russia is a massive producer, a massive exporter of oil. And the U.S. of course has banned Russian oil imports. Doesn't make a huge difference to us, but that has, I think, helped spur the oil market to reasonably high heights. And of course, even more than that, you've got in Europe wrestling with its energy dependence on Russian oil and gas, in particular Germany, which I think imports something like 55% of its natural gas from Russia. And so that dependence has really contributed to this geopolitical crisis. I think of this as like, there are two crises now that we have to deal with. There's the long-term crisis of climate change that we've been all focused on, and then there's the immediate crisis, and the immediate and near-term crisis, not only of the war itself, but also of the global order and Putin's threat to that. I think in the near term, these potentially involve some trade-offs that need to be managed carefully. I'm just thinking of calls to increase production and export of oil and gas in the U.S., which, frankly, I think there is cause to think about how to do that, although only if you can do that in a kind of time frame that matters, which is hard. But I think there is reasonable, there's a real value in helping to reduce European dependence in the near term on Russian oil and gas. I think in the long term, though, those crises point in the same direction, which is accelerating the transition to clean energy, zero carbon sources and away from fossil fuels. So it's not a guarantee, because you could imagine policymakers going in a different direction. But there's a danger of getting stuck in the middle, where we make investments now in fossil fuel infrastructure under the aegis, under the guise of helping Europe, but it takes too long to help Europe, and yet it sticks around for the long term. So I think there is that middle run trap. But if we do good policy, I think the interests of solving the immediate geopolitical crisis and the long-term climate crisis are well aligned. And they both involve accelerating investments in clean energy. And for the US, that gets back to the policies I was talking about earlier. I'll say one thing in terms of the bridge to COP27 as well. There's another crisis looming on the horizon, which I think we're all probably aware of as well, which is a food crisis. Russia and Ukraine being massive exporters as well of wheat, but also soybeans, sunflower oil, corn, fertilizer. I think that's going to be something we're going to see in Egypt, right? That food crisis is going to be hitting in vulnerable countries, especially, not exclusively, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in North Africa. And so I think we're going to be seeing that play out as a backdrop to COP27. That's going to heighten issues around adaptation. It's going to heighten potential trade-offs and maybe long-term, ideally, synergies around things like regenerative agriculture and how do we increase the sustainability of crop production in places that are increasingly vulnerable to climate threats. So that is going to be the backdrop to COP27. I think that's bound to really shift and shape the conversation. Even whatever happens to the war itself, we're going to see the lingering effects of it in food prices.
Thanks, Nat. Yeah, I mean, we've already seen the food crisis angle play out in discussions about feedstocks for alternative fuels, for instance, potentially in conservation, nature-based solutions. Dirk, before I turn to you on the impacts and the modeling that you did, I think Lisa wanted to follow up on some of the things Nat said.
Yeah, we do a lot of ESG work for corporates and corporate reporting. And this is where the E and the S are really colliding. We've got a very significant social humanitarian rights problem that is likely to be exacerbated, particularly through food and food scarcity as a function of a number of these conflicts. And it's almost like a negative potentiation loop where you have food scarcity resulting in conflict, resulting in geopolitical conflict, resulting in more food scarcity. And we go down this associated swirling funnel. And it's going to sound like heresy in this room in particular, but embracing the realities of markets right now, where we're at in the oil and gas market, where we're at in the agricultural commodities market, the quicker we can get to, particularly as North Americans, net zero oil, net zero gas, net zero grains, the more likely we have the ability to affect a just transition of the energy market. And as I say, I know that sounds like heresy to a number of your ears, but this is the reality of where we're at right now.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think that cues you up, Dirk, perfectly, because what are the impacts of what's going on? What does the modeling tell us?
So first of all, I should say, I feel like we've just scratched the surface, right? We've had one workshop, but we've had a project underway that I think all of you have participated in with the Pacific Northwest National Lab and University of Maryland. Jay Edmonds and Shaw Yu are the modelers that one of the modeling teams that we have used in the US for a very long time. I know when I was in government, we relied on Jay's modeling of the Kyoto market architecture. It's really interesting, like when you look at the claims or the pledges that have been put on the table thus far, and you say Russia's pulled back and has become a pariah and nobody wants to cooperate with them. What does that do to Article 6 trade flows? And what we found that's really interesting, again, just the high level of it, is that it enables a bunch of others, because Russia's a seller in the normal modeling. But I don't think any of us would think that countries are going to entrust their climate, their future climate aspirations to reliance on Russia in the same way. So what it does is it brings a bunch of other sellers out. The global price reduces just by a couple of bucks. I think in 2030, it went from $30 to $33. So the price goes up because Russia low-cost sales are not on the market. In 2050, it went more like from 182 to 184. So it doesn't harm the rest of the market if everybody else is galvanized to cooperate together, which I think we've been seeing in other respects, in some of the energy elements that Matt and Lisa pointed to. We're seeing people step up and want to help fill the gaps, because it's Europe that's hit the hardest from this, because Europe's near-term aspirations relied a lot, they frankly relied very little on Article 6 outside the Union, but relied a lot on Russian gas in the near term. And if you take that out of the equation, then I think Europe's going to need to rethink their Article 6 posture. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, Kelley, having worked in the belly of the beast there. But it's very hard for Europe to get to net zero without, it basically means they've got to accelerate a lot of things in order to fill the gap of that much Russian gas. The other thing that was a real lesson in it was, you know who gets hurt the most in it is Russia, because they lose nearly $1 trillion in investment or in trade flows over the course of the next 30 or 40 years. So it's a real, it's a shame of what it's done to the global dynamic, but it could have that effect. Now, the other thing that we're exploring a bit further that will be really interesting to pick apart is Russia is part of the Belt and Road Initiative with China. So there is a possibility that Russia teams up with others. I don't know if the rest of the Belt and Road folks would like that, because there are certainly some countries that are part of Belt and Road that wouldn't like that alliance. But we modeled that as well. It's like, what if there's Belt and Road and one, that's one division, and the other division is everybody else, which is like most of the OECD. And what you see is a market that has bifurcated pricing, right? Because it would hurt everybody else if China and Russia team up. You have a lot of low-cost mitigation that stays in that club, but they lose access to the more attractive international market price, and everybody else ends up doing more deep decarbonization at home, albeit at a higher price, but without reliance on folks in the Belt and Road. Whether that's a realistic thing to think about, we just thought that it was one proxy of a set of countries that could team up. I suspect it'll be more complicated than that, but I do think it's an area that we ought to study further and understand some of these implications, because it is a completely new reality. It's not the reality that we thought about with Article 6, that you'd be seeing it kind of have an explosive thing happen right in the middle of it that's going to change the cooperation dynamics going forward in fundamental ways.
Thanks, Dirk. And just to the European point, I was a European policymaker for many years. I know the accent doesn't sound like that, but somehow it's true. I think it's interesting because we used to write briefings, for the ministers. And one of the options always, if the price was going to get too high, was to think about opening up the EU again to international credits. There were several options. And what's amusing in today's context is that was like, if the price went north of 25 euros, if the price went north of 30 euros, surely we would have no political support for the EU ETS anymore. And we would have to find a way to open up, a steam valve. But we're in a context where the price is what, $100, 75 euros, 78 euros?
Yeah.
And that we still haven't seen that, but I imagine it's still an option on the table in the background. I no longer write those briefings, so I don't know. But with this extra bit of pressure, it's certainly possible. I have so many more questions that I want to ask all three of you, but we only have 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we give the audience the opportunity to also ask any questions that they might have. I'm going to stand up because I can't see the questions from there. Sorry, Lisa, I'm abandoning you. Let's take 2 or 3 at once and then come to everybody. Arthur.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. And I too thank all 4 of these giants. Really brought home Article 6, so thank you. Again, Arthur Lee with Chevron and IETA Council member with Lisa. I'd like to direct the question actually to Dirk, but perhaps even Kelley or on that also you might want to address it too. The modeling that Jay, Edmund, Xiaoyu are doing. What you mentioned about the Belt and Road, China, Russia. Actually, I think it could be a lot worse than that. It could be India. India too has already expressed that the traditional non-aligned nature, and India is it's almost supportive of Russia. So there's that, and of course the whole Article 6 thing really is about clubs of emission trading, right? But it's quite possible that countries like that could also reduce their commitment to do anything more. So it's not just that they form clubs of some kind, but that they don't do much more. So then that you would have to then model other countries, other clubs doing more to achieve the target. So that actually is a little bit more of a pessimistic bent on my part to view this whole crisis. So thanks, if you can react to that.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more and then go back to the panel.
Hi, very interesting presentation. My name is Corinne Boone. I've been around the space for a long time. Probably, I think 30 years. I just a couple of interesting observations I wanted to make. Canadian, proud Canadian as well. And I think this is one of the few times where we've seen the C in E, i.e. the climate in ESG, really become much more pivotal in the discussion. I work also half my time in ESG as well. And in Canada, we've been having these discussions for years about the fact that, you know, Canadian oil and gas companies have, you know, reduced their carbon footprint, you know, significantly over the years. And if you look at the geopolitical crisis and, you know, would you rather buy your oil and gas from Canada or the US, or would you rather buy your oil and gas from the Middle East and Russia? And this is where I think this is coming head on. So it's not just the S and the E and S and the communities and that sort of thing. It's really become an ethical question within the ESG perspective, and something we really need to consider. We have a lot of companies in North America that in the oil and gas sector that recognize they need to do something to get to net zero, but also recognize they can produce oil in a clean manner or switch, you know, fuel switch. And I think that's a real interesting discussion for me. And I just wanted to know if you had any perspectives in that regard. And then the other comment that I want to make is something you said right at the very beginning. You can either, Lisa, you said you can either fight regulation and figure out how to try to go around it in the carbon markets, but the financial regulators are here to stay. And I work for a carbon exchange, and we're in the financial regulation process right now. And I hate to say this, but it's actually a breath of fresh air, because it makes everything much more transparent. So I think whereas in the years before, we never had an opportunity to really have a transparent market, we have that now. And so I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that as well. Thank you.
Both really good questions. Who would like to take either of those or both of those up first?
I'm happy
Lisa?
to.
Oh, Dirk, you go ahead, please.
I was going to jump in. I'd love to talk on both of them, but I know Nat's had some interesting conversations lately on the SEC and CFTC. I've already spoken to it, so I'll leave that for Nat and Lisa. But it's good to hear Corinne's voice, even though I can't see her. But on Arthur's point about I think you're underscoring why we want to explore this a little bit further in that Belt and Road scenario that I talked about that we modeled. India came out a big winner because India is not in the Belt and Road Initiative, it's in the other club. So it's getting to attract loads of investment because it's not just India, but India and Colombia and I think a few of the African providers all kind of grew because the assumption was that China and Russia are kind of dominating this other trading bloc. Oddly enough, China turns into a buyer in that scenario because as they're trying to reach their aspirations, they've got access to a lot of low-cost mitigation of other Belt and Road people. Now, again, these are not definitive in any way. They're thought experiments and illustrating them with numbers. But I think it really does underscore, to me, it underscores the importance of, as you think about an Article 6 strategy, of having a plan for diverse supply and being part of a diverse group. That's one of the whole reasons you want to be in it. And oddly enough, my old energy department days, that's also in times of energy crisis, one of the things that you want is diverse supply lines, which is why we're talking about those questions about clean energy exports and imports. And I think that's one of the challenges of where Europe is right now on, they have held back on use of Article 6, except as it applies within the EU, but they don't have a very diverse Article 6 supply line, not as diverse as what Japan has in mind, for example. And it really may be something that for environmental security, they need to think through, just like they're exploring on the energy side, other possible gas imports. So it's reshuffled things in some really interesting ways. So hopefully when we come back next year to NACW, we'll have even more of this to sort of share insights on.
Thanks, Dirk. Nat.
Sure, thanks. We could probably talk all day about the implications of Ukraine on trade. So I think I'll leave it with where where Dirk left it. Just quickly on Corinne's points. I mean, on both questions. One is the question around kind of the intersection of ethical approaches and, you know, social and the sort of ESG and the role of climate there and how that intersects with oil and gas in particular. I mean, one observation is just to the extent you're thinking about how Ukraine and the maybe in a broader context affects thinking about oil and gas production in the US and in Canada, North America more generally, I think one key issue is that we know from recent studies that methane leakage is the big climate issue associated with oil and gas production. Folks at my former organization, Environmental Defense Fund, have been pioneering that, and now I think it's really front and center for a lot of folks on the global agenda. And that is an area where where already I think the US and Canada are in good position, but much more can and needs to be done to cut methane emissions much more dramatically, especially if we're talking about LNG, where there's so many more points in the value chain, including the transportation itself, for methane to be released. But if we can really clean that up and really cut methane emissions dramatically, so I should say where the leak rates may be, and it's a lot of uncertainty, which is why we need more measurement. But leak rates don't have to get very high for natural gas to no longer look like such a great climate deal once you're thinking about the whole value chain. But if you can get those methane leaks cut down really low through regulations, but also through steps that firms can take that save them, at least are pretty cost effective because you're also saving the methane from escaping, then you're in a position to have oil and in particular natural gas contribute much more to addressing climate impacts in the near term. So I think that methane emissions is like top of mind and should be for folks in the oil and gas industry, as I know it is. The other piece on transparent markets, I think that's a really interesting piece. Dirk touched on the role that financial markets and financial regulators, Lisa did as well, are playing as a driver for the voluntary market considerations. I do know, from having conversations with folks in the US government, the SEC put that out there, mentioned the role of carbon credits in their rule on disclosure. CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, is interested in this because there are already some trades happening in futures, which gives them an interest in the underlying. And the Treasury, Department of the Treasury, is interested in this because they're interested more broadly in stable markets. And so I think there's a really interesting convergence here. And there's a real interest as well in much more transparent markets. And I think ultimately that'll, not in addition to being a driver for interest in credit markets, I think in carbon credit markets, I think it'll also be a good way to shine light and improve the sort of the transparency and the liquidity of them.
Thanks, Nat. Lisa, do you want to come in?
I do. Let me start with the micro and then go back up to the macro, following up on a couple of the great points that were made by Nat and Dirk. It's not enough to say we're ethical anymore. And what you see is really big money, i.e. global multinationals, in particular financial institutions that are reporting under 5, 6, 7, 8 main jurisdictions are trying to find commonality. And regulators around the world, most recently through the IFRS's new body, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which released 2 standards this week. This week, I'm getting my weeks confused. I think it was this week, maybe it was Friday. Really look to try and standardize precisely what you can and can't say. And the big deal is qualitative statements are very troublesome. If you can't back them with hardcore data and numbers regarding emissions, emission reductions, associated social parameters, you're in trouble. And so read that loud and clear. Claims is the name of the game going forward. Claims is the name of the game going forward, and be very wary about what claims you're making. And to that end, I think methane is one of the key measurable, certain, determinable, easily verifiable claims that you can make. And that made reference to the Global Methane Pact, which is a 30% reduction from baselines. Canada has gone further, and I think in part of the oil and gas activities has had to go further to commit to 75% of methane emission reductions. So these are areas where we can reconcile the present with the pathway toward the future. And I think both Dirk and Nat have made that point very strongly.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more quick round of questions.
Hi, Sean Donovan with Cargill. So my question is about human resources and corresponding adjustments. Because as I understand how corresponding adjustments will work on a day-to-day basis, it requires a designated national authority to review the offset projects, see how it fits into the NDC, and if they can, allow the credits to be exported. But a lot of countries, probably 150, are low or middle income, and they might have 5 or 10 people working in the Ministry of Environment to do all the climate policy. And so they don't have a process yet for getting letters of assurance. So my question is, what is the plan for most countries to actually implement corresponding adjustments? Thanks.
Anyone for the last round of questions? I don't see, oh, gentleman over.
Great, thank you. This is Brad Neff with Radical, and I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for taking your time to be here. Really appreciate the perspectives. And maybe just as a wrap-up question, kind of like the one I asked yesterday, is we talked a lot about how, I'd like to hear about how we unlock more capital. We need more action on the ground, and I appreciate all that you're doing in Article 6 and up at the 30,000 foot level to set the structure. Seems like every time there's a change up there, it trickles down and capital gets frozen. They need to readjust, reassess. And so how do we keep the action on the ground moving at the pace that it needs to move while we're building this airplane and we're getting everything else figured out? Thanks.
Thank you. A great wrap-up question. Lisa, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, let me start with the first one because I'm a corresponding adjustment geek and I love talking about corresponding adjustments in general. And let me tell you a war story. Early on in the CDM market, I was doing capacity building in South America and the Francophonie in North Africa. And I was speaking to a crowd of effectively regulators who are part of the DNA. And I was saying, these are the steps that you need to go to ensure that your letters of authorization are appropriate and how you reconcile them with your inventories, etc. And I was told in French, in no uncertain terms, Madame DeMarco, tu sais rien, you know nothing. There are 2 of us. How do you expect 2 of us to accomplish this? Fast forward. This is where I think we can see the benefits of some technological solutions, particularly as it pertains to monitoring and reporting and verification of emissions, reconciling with corresponding adjustments, some of this taking the form of distributed ledger technology for those purposes. I'm reserved in terms of other purposes for DLT, but particularly for measurement, monitoring, and reporting to automate some of those functions is going to be incredibly important. And relying on the supranational organizations to help build capacity or take away some of the tasks in corresponding adjustments and clear, transparent, accurate, verifiable calculation of those corresponding adjustments is going to be very, very important. Let me move to Brad's question in and around market changes, restricting or causing road bumps in access to capital. We're in the early stages of market formation, and so we do anticipate road bumps in the launch and growth and development of markets and the corresponding access to capital. But let me also be very clear, what we see most often is not limited capital, but limited great projects for that capital right now. one of the big developments, as I spoke about previously, is standardization in how we report on them, how we account for them, and how any ultimate source of capital can claim those projects and the associated emission reductions. So hopefully the ISSB, IFRS, the SEC, I love all these acronyms, right? New set, SEC, CFTC, the Canadian Securities Administrators, IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, will all provide for the cavalry. I'm borrowing a term from a banker, the cavalry of climate markets to access that capital in a very meaningful and large way.
Lisa, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to turn to you, Dirk and Nat. Nat first, if you could just be very brief.
Sure. I'll actually answer in a way both of them, and I want to get back to what Dirk raised about the voluntary carbon market, because I think that will be a lot of the answer to Brad's question about how do we scale up capital and finance into real action on the ground while we're putting together the Article 6 market. So not in place of that, but while we're doing everything that Lisa just talked about. And there's also a link to Sean's question about corresponding adjustments, because in that interim period, I think there's an opportunity to use voluntary carbon markets to get some of those, if the claims are appropriate, to go back to Lisa's memorable point, to use voluntary carbon markets to scale up finance, even without corresponding adjustments, as long as the claim is very clear about what the contribution is. And I would just underscore, since we're very low on time, I would just underscore these twin efforts: the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI, which is really focused on claims and the demand side, and the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market that Dirk and I and Kelley are all involved in, that is focused on a threshold standard for quality. I think if we get that right, if we get integrity right, our mantra is sort of build integrity and scale will follow. Is if we get integrity right, if we create confidence and make it simple for companies with voluntary commitments to help meet those commitments, in part through really high quality carbon credits, I think we will see finance really scale and effectively help drive emissions reductions and sustainable growth on the ground.
Thank you, Nat. I couldn't agree more. I think this market needs clarity. I think one of the main benefits of the voluntary carbon market is to drive this private capital to where it needs to go. We know for sure that public capital isn't enough. I just abused my role as moderator and I don't care. Dirk.
I love it. I love it. I should probably entrust my last minute to you, Kelley, because I know we share a lot of the same vision. I guess I'm going to mainly hit on the point, Nat's point about scale, and the way of getting to scale is really about building up that investor confidence, right? And that is what these initiatives are about. And I really hope we can make them work and deliver on that. On the point from our friend from Cargill about, I totally worry about that, about the capacity in developing countries. It's one of the reasons that we're really happy to work closely with the multilateral development banks who are helping to produce those models of, and advice to their client countries on how to get set up. And I like that because when I look back to that era that Lisa was describing on the CDM, I remember when I was at NatSource back in the old days, not knowing how in the world you were going to get a letter of approval for a CDM project in a country that didn't know what the CDM was, right? And it was part of the Kyoto Protocol, but they didn't pay much attention to it because they were focused on other parts of that. And we worried about it a lot. And we worried about how you were going to get the agree. You also have a letter from the buy side that was sort of acknowledging that they had no problem with it. So we went through a period where all of that was mysterious. And then inside of about a year, there were standard models that were used everywhere on those letters. And there was sort of a standard process on getting that host authority named and getting the authorities clarified. And again, the World Bank was hugely helpful back then, and I think will be again. So let's, but it's something we all need to work together on to get those good models in place. They have to be legally drawn up, in a proper way, and the authorities really do have to work. But there is a lot of work underway on that, and parts of it we're involved in, but other organizations as well. Again, back then, Kelley, you'll love to know that that's how I got to know Martin Hessian, the EU Article 6 negotiator who used to sit at your side. Was I used to call him up to harass him about getting letters of acknowledgement from the UK government after we had gotten the letter of approval from a CDM host country. So it can be done. We just need to do it all again.
Thank you, everyone. And we're finishing right on, we're 1 minute over, so I failed twice as moderator. Craig, I'm sorry. I understand I won't be invited back. I feel sad about that. But before we get up, please, this was a panel of climate superstars, and please join me in thanking them.